Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? What if I told you that the single phrase that was repeated to me my entire childhood, the one that made me feel safe about my future and made me believe I could step into adulthood without being crushed by debt, turned out to be a complete lie? And that I only learned the full truth years later when I was already deep into loan payments, juggling shifts, and then watching my younger brother brag about how our parents had just wired the entire amount of his law school tuition in one clean shot. That is where this begins, and that is the moment I realized everything I had believed about fairness in our family was just a story they told me to keep me quiet. When I was a kid, my parents would repeat, over and over, that they had a college fund for me, that I should not worry, that I just needed to get good grades, and everything else would fall into place. I grew up with that as a baseline fact, like knowing the sky is blue or that we went to the same church every Sunday. I never questioned it because why would I? Parents do not look their kid in the eye and lie for years unless they really want to build an entire narrative around it. So I graduated high school, applied to schools, and when the acceptance letters came in, I waited for them to sit me down with a plan. What I got instead was a series of vague conversations about loans build character, and everybody works through college these days, which at the time I swallowed, thinking maybe the fund was smaller than they had hoped, but at least there would be some contribution. I was wrong. The reality was brutal. I worked 2 jobs during my undergrad years, one in a campus dining hall and another at a retail store that did not care if you had an exam the next day. I signed loan after loan, all in my name, at interest rates that made me sick to my stomach when I calculated the long-term cost. When I complained or broke down under the stress, my mom would sigh and remind me, "This is what adulthood is, Natalie, you learn responsibility." And I believed maybe she was right, maybe I was just soft, maybe this was the only way. But every time I visited home and saw the vacations they took, the new car my dad leased, or the way my brother Evan never seemed to be denied anything he asked for, a small voice inside me wondered if there was more to the story. Fast forward a few years. I am in my late 20s, still paying down student loans, still budgeting like every dollar is my last. Evan calls me one night and casually mentions that mom and dad just finished paying off his first year of law school in full. He says it with no awareness, like he is sharing good news, like I should be celebrating for him. I sit there, gripping the phone so hard I can feel my knuckles ache, and I ask him to repeat what he just said. He laughs, like it is no big deal, and says, "Yeah, they said they saved for this for years, so it is all covered. They even told me not to worry about books or fees. They want me to focus on being the best student I can be." In that moment, something snapped inside me. It was not just the money, though the money mattered. It was the realization that they had lied straight to my face for years, and when I needed them most, they had vanished behind a wall of excuses, only to suddenly become the most generous parents alive when it was their son on the receiving end. I hung up quickly, making some excuse about being tired, but I barely slept that night. Every word they had ever said about fairness, about supporting me, about how they had done all they could, started replaying in my head like a broken record, and for the first time I saw the cracks clearly. The next morning, I went through every box of old papers I had kept. I dug out loan agreements, financial aid forms, even a few old texts where my mom had written things like, "We can't pull from the fund right now, it's locked in," which at the time had made sense, but now felt like blatant manipulation. I stacked everything in piles across my living room floor, and the more I looked at it, the angrier I became. I was not just the unlucky one who got stuck with debt, I had been systematically lied to. And the worst part? They thought I would never put the pieces together. That day, I also made a decision that felt small, but became the first move in a chain of choices that would change everything. I cut them off financially in every single subtle way they had been leaning on me for years without even acknowledging it. I canceled the family phone plan that had my name on it, forcing them to open their own. I stopped paying for little things that had become routine, like subscriptions they forgot to update or groceries I was always guilt-tripped into covering during visits. I told myself if they could fund law school with one check, then they could cover their own Netflix bill. But here is the part that really set my mind spinning. I remembered something Aunt Linda had once said, offhand, when I was still in high school. She mentioned a custodial account that my parents had set up in my name when I was a baby, something my grandfather had contributed to for years. At the time, I brushed it off, assuming it was the same mythical college fund my parents talked about. But now, with the new information about Evan, that comment took on a whole new weight. Custodial accounts do not just disappear. They're in the child's name, and the money is supposed to be used for that child's benefit. I picked up the phone and called Aunt Linda, my heart pounding. She hesitated at first, like she was not sure she should get involved, but then she lowered her voice and said 9 words that made the room spin. "I think that account was originally in your name." And that was when I knew the story was far from over. I don't think I've ever stared at a ceiling as long as I did that night, with Aunt Linda's words replaying in my head over and over like a loop I couldn't exit, because for the first time in years, I wasn't just angry, I was certain there was proof. Something real and traceable that would either confirm I was losing my mind or, more likely, confirm that I had been deliberately deceived in a way that was so calculated, so quiet, and so self-serving that it actually made me feel nauseous just imagining how many years they must have told each other that I would never figure it out, that I'd be too polite, too tired, or too loyal to go looking for the truth they'd buried behind the vague answers and moral lectures. And that's when I decided to stop remembering and start investigating, because memories are messy and manipulatable, especially when you're the kid who is always told you're dramatic or too emotional. But receipts, hard records, paperwork, data, those don't change. They don't shift depending on who's telling the story, and they certainly don't get embarrassed into silence at family dinners, so I spent my entire weekend building the timeline they had never expected me to piece together. Beginning with every single loan statement I'd ever kept, right down to the weirdly formal emails my dad sent during college admissions, where he used phrases like, "Let us know what the financial aid package offers," instead of ever saying directly that they wouldn't be contributing. I opened a shared spreadsheet because something about that felt right. This was no longer emotional venting, it was a forensic audit, and I started plugging in numbers. Dates of loan disbursements, tuition billing cycles, part-time income ones scraped together, amounts I'd transferred to pay for books, rent, groceries, plus the federal loan interest that kept growing even during the grace period, and as I filled in the cells, something else began to click. Something uglier than I had prepared. For every time they told me to trust the process or "we're supporting you in our own way," they weren't just dodging responsibility. They were actively using my situation to benefit themselves. Because I remembered something Maya once told me when we were both working extra shifts to cover rent. If your parents claim you as a dependent while you're the one actually paying, they're probably cashing in on tax credits you should have received. So I did something I should have done years ago. I called Maya, who now works full-time in accounting, and I asked her to meet for coffee, and when I laid out the situation, I didn't have to finish before she interrupted me and said, "This sounds like a 529 or UTMA that got converted, probably right before your financial aid forms were due." She told me exactly which forms to request, which IRS transcripts to pull, and even helped me write the emails to the institutions that had handled the accounts when I was younger, banks I didn't even remember having any connection to. And within 2 weeks, I had my first official confirmation. There had, in fact, been an account opened in my name when I was a child, funded by my grandfather over several years, which was legally designated for my benefit and which, according to the transaction history, had been liquidated and rolled into a general family trust the summer before I started college. Now let that sink in. Not only did my parents use money that was supposed to be mine, intended to fund my education, but they did it just early enough to make sure it wouldn't be considered an asset in my financial aid application. And just late enough that I had no way of knowing it had ever existed unless I went digging like this. And you know what else I found in those documents? A notation that Evan's educational costs were projected using the same family trust they had folded my funds into, meaning they didn't just take from me. They redirected what was mine to fund his future while watching me rack up debt I would be paying off well into my 30s. The worst part? They still had the audacity to claim me as a dependent for tax purposes the entire time I was in college, even the years I lived completely on my own and filed my own taxes, which, according to Maya, not only robbed me of potential education tax credits, but may have violated the IRS's dependency rules altogether. And before you say maybe they didn't know better, let me stop you there. Because my mom works in payroll and my dad files taxes like it's a sport, they knew exactly what they were doing. They just assumed I would never look that closely. So with Maya's help, I filed amended returns for every single year I qualified for educational credits, legally, factually, and with full documentation to back it up, and while I knew that wouldn't undo the debt or erase the resentment, it was the first step toward reclaiming the truth and making sure they didn't get away with rewriting history in their favor. And maybe it sounds petty, maybe it sounds like I was overreacting, but when you've spent years being gaslit into thinking your struggle was just normal, or that your pain was character building while someone else was gifted the golden staircase you were told didn't exist, you stop caring about looking polite and start caring about balance. A few days later, I got a call from my mom. She never calls. She texts like a millennial now, and her voice was shaking, not angry, not hostile, just scared in that way where people know their grip on the narrative is slipping fast. She said, "Natalie, we need to talk tonight. It's about the college money. Please don't do anything rash." I said nothing at first, just let the silence stretch, because for once, I wanted her to hear how it felt to be on the edge of something big, with no clue what's coming next. And when I hung up, I knew I wasn't done. I was just getting started. When I walked into my parents' house that evening, there was no hug, no warm smile, no casual greeting like there used to be when I visited as the daughter who called every Sunday and remembered birthdays, because now the air had changed and they could feel it too. That low-level panic that settles in when the person you've underestimated for years suddenly shows up with something more powerful than anger, proof. My dad was already seated at the dining table, elbows resting on the wood like he wanted to anchor himself to something before I even spoke, while my mom hovered near the kitchen counter, fidgeting with a dish towel she didn't need. And for the first few minutes, we didn't say anything at all, just sat in the echo of a family that used to have rhythm, but had been cracked open by silence and paperwork. I didn't bring a speech. I didn't rehearse anything in my head because I knew this wasn't about convincing them of anything anymore. It was about presenting the facts and watching them choose how to react now that denial wasn't an option. So I pulled a thin manila folder from my bag, laid it on the table like a dealer in a game I wasn't planning to lose, and said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "This is the timeline. These are the bank transfers, the custodial account records, the tax filings, and the exact amounts I paid for school compared to what you claimed on your returns. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to be clear." My dad didn't move at first, but I could see the color rising in his face, the kind of slow, boiling realization that no amount of righteous parenting rhetoric could cover anymore, because these weren't accusations, they were itemized facts. My mom finally sat down and said something about how they had done the best they could with what they had, and I just looked at her and asked one question, the same one that had been burning a hole in my chest since the day I spoke to Aunt Linda. Who authorized moving my custodial account into a general trust? She blinked like she hadn't expected that specific question, like maybe she thought this would be about feelings and favoritism, and that she could soothe it with a well-timed, "We love you both the same," but this wasn't about love. This was about legality and ethics and whether they saw me as someone worth investing in or just someone they could harvest benefits from without offering anything back. My dad mumbled something about needing flexibility when Evan was younger and having to make a choice, and I didn't even flinch because the choice they made was now right there in black and white. They didn't just fail to help me. They used what was mine to pay for someone else and then acted like I should be grateful they didn't do worse. I stood up, not because I was storming out, but because I didn't want to stay in that house a second longer than necessary. I left the folder on the table, told them I wouldn't be discussing this further in person, and walked out without waiting for a reply. And that night, instead of venting to friends or writing some dramatic social media post, I drafted a single email, calm, short, and addressed only to the people who needed to know, the ones who had heard for years that I was independent by choice or that Natalie refused help because she's stubborn. I wrote it to Aunt Linda, Uncle Ray, and my godmother Barbara, and all I said was this: I paid for college on my own. The fund that was supposed to be used for me was repurposed. I was claimed as a dependent for years. I wasn't supported. I just wanted you to have the facts. I didn't attach documents, didn't add opinion, didn't say anything that could be seen as an attack. I just set the record straight, because I was done letting other people shape my story with their edited version of reality. And the strangest thing happened. Within a day, Aunt Linda replied with a 2-sentence note that said, "I always wondered." I'm sorry they did that. That was it. No drama, no explosion. Just quiet validation, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted because it lands like a weight being lifted. And then, as if the universe wanted to test whether I was really committed to this new boundary, I got a call from Evan. Not a text. Not a voice memo. A full call. And when I answered, his tone was already sharp, like he had built up 3 days of tension waiting for the moment to let it out. He accused me of smearing our parents, of airing family issues to outsiders, and then, like he had rehearsed it, dropped the final line, "If you keep dragging this out, I'll handle it legally." I didn't yell, didn't laugh, didn't even explain myself. I just said, "Great. Let me know what your attorney finds in the trust documents," and I hung up before he could reply. Because here's the thing, I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of the backlash. Not of being labeled the difficult daughter, or the dramatic one who couldn't let go. Because I wasn't holding on out of spite. I was documenting, I was clarifying, and I was drawing a line between who I had been raised to be and who I had become now that the curtain was pulled back and the script no longer held. I didn't know what their next move would be, but I knew mine. And it was going to be official. By the time I sat down with Ben to walk through everything, I was no longer coming from a place of raw emotion or disbelief or even betrayal. Because all of that had already burned itself out somewhere between the second tax transcript and the confirmation that my custodial account had been absorbed into a so-called family fund without my knowledge or consent. Instead, I was calm, focused, and completely ready to treat this situation exactly like what it had become, not a family misunderstanding, not a generational difference in values, but a financial and legal breach that had tangible consequences for me and zero accountability for the people who caused it. Ben is not a lawyer, not officially anyway, but working at a mid-sized legal firm as a paralegal for the last 6 years had made him more knowledgeable than most entry-level associates, and I trusted him because he had known me before all of this. Back when I was still hustling through student loans and double shifts and never once thought to question whether my parents had done something unethical, let alone potentially illegal. We sat down over coffee on a quiet Saturday, and I laid it all out, the bank records, the transfer logs, the UTMA documentation from the original account, the tax records showing I was claimed as a dependent even while I paid every cent of my own way, and most importantly, the timeline showing when the money was moved, when I started college, and when Evan's law school was paid for, all lined up like a domino trail that led straight back to 2 people who had counted on my silence for over a decade. Ben didn't flinch. He didn't give me the usual, "Well, it's complicated," or try to play devil's advocate, or suggest that maybe I was taking things too far. He looked at the timeline, nodded slowly, and said, "They knew exactly what they were doing. And you have more leverage than you think." And then he helped me write a letter, not a dramatic letter, not a furious one filled with accusations or moral outrage, but a clean, legally referenced, bulletproof demand for resolution. It outlined the facts, cited the original Uniform Transfers to Minors Act guidelines, included the transaction history from the custodial account, and spelled out in exact terms what I expected. Either a repayment of the amount that had been misappropriated, structured as a monthly reimbursement with a clear end date, or a signed acknowledgement of what happened, along with a written agreement that they would not attempt to claim me in any future financial capacity, tax-related or otherwise. I wasn't looking for revenge, not the petty kind, not the kind you see in movies with public shaming and explosive confrontations. I was looking for balance, for rectification. For a moment where the record was not just emotionally corrected but legally acknowledged, because if they had used my name, my social security number, my education to benefit themselves while leaving me to carry the full weight of the consequences, then the least they could do was put their signature on a document. That admitted the truth. And before you ask, yes, I considered what this might do to the already fragile thread that existed between us, but at that point, I wasn't willing to protect relationships that had already been constructed on lies and quiet theft. We sent the letter certified mail, with return receipt requested, addressed to both my mother and my father individually, with copies placed in envelopes marked personal and confidential, not to humiliate, not to escalate, but to make it undeniable that the information had reached them and that their opportunity to respond, resolve, and repair was now on a formal timeline. I didn't call, didn't warn them, didn't ask permission, because people who betray your trust at that level do not get advance notice when you finally decide to act like you matter. While I waited for the response, and Ben said they had 30 calendar days to reply before we filed a complaint, I did something that should have felt small, but felt massive. I updated every single emergency contact, HR form, bank account beneficiary, and insurance record to remove their names completely, because it occurred to me, somewhere in the middle of all this, that I had spent years keeping them as part of my adult life by default, not by choice, and that was no longer acceptable. I wasn't going to risk them benefiting from anything else I had built, even by accident, because I'd already spent far too long pretending that family meant shared values when, in my case, it had only meant shared obligation with none of the return. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't vent to friends. I didn't make cryptic posts online. I just moved in silence, protected myself, documented everything, and waited, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted every move I made to be grounded in facts and control, not emotion. And then, on day 27, just before the deadline passed, a letter arrived. It was addressed by hand in my father's writing, and inside was not the response I expected. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even angry. It was quiet. It was short. And it contained one line that changed everything. We used the funds because your grandfather said Evan would need advanced school more than you. I read it twice, then a third time, and each time the words hit me differently, first with confusion, then with rage, and then with the cold clarity that comes when you realize the people who raised you had always seen your path as smaller, as less deserving, as somehow already fulfilled without their help. That sentence told me everything I needed to know, not just about the money, but about the hierarchy they had built in their minds, the one I was never supposed to question. And the irony is, they could have lied again. They could have blamed paperwork or memory lapses or financial emergencies. But they didn't. They told the truth. And it was worse than anything I had imagined. So I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a folder with everything else, and sat down at my desk with one last task in front of me, the move they would never see coming, the move that would end this chapter not with a bang, but with a lock they could never pick. Because if they thought the trust my grandfather left was meant for Evan, then I was going to show them exactly what it looked like when someone uses a different kind of trust, the kind you build yourself, document by document, boundary by boundary, to shut the door for good. It's strange how clarity doesn't always come with a dramatic breakdown or a slam of a door or some perfectly delivered line in a tearful confrontation. Sometimes it just arrives as a kind of stillness, a quiet moment where the fog finally lifts and you're left staring at the truth, not with shock or anger, but with a steady, almost clinical realization that there is no more space left for negotiation, no more lines left to cross, and certainly no more chances left to offer, because when someone shows you not only that they're willing to choose someone else over you, but that they did so with full awareness, conviction, and long-term planning, you stop asking why and you start answering for yourself, not out loud, not with drama, but with actions that are irreversible, enforceable, and completely devoid of performance. After reading that one line, your grandfather said Evan would need advanced school more than you, I didn't cry or call anyone or pace around looking for a loophole in their words that might soften the blow. I simply stood up, opened the cabinet where I kept all my legal and financial documents, and pulled out the folder I had been quietly building for weeks, the one labeled Lock It Down, a title that had started as a joke with Maya but now felt eerily appropriate, because that folder contained everything I needed to ensure that whatever damage had been done up to this point would never be allowed to extend into my future, no matter how much guilt, manipulation, or familial duty they tried to use as currency down the line. I made an appointment with an attorney the following Monday, not someone flashy or overpriced or connected to my parents' circle, but a no-nonsense estate planner who came highly recommended by one of Ben's senior partners. And within 15 minutes of our first meeting, she understood exactly what I wanted. No ambiguity, no potential backdoors, no shared access or optional clauses. I wanted a living trust that made my intentions and my boundaries absolutely unbreakable. Every asset I had, my house, my retirement account, my investment portfolio, my insurance policies, and even the intellectual property rights to the business I had built on my own dime, with no help from anyone, was to be moved under the trust, with clearly named beneficiaries who were selected not based on blood, but based on behavior, support, and integrity. I didn't name my parents. I didn't name Evan. I didn't leave room for reconciliation by including some placeholder clause that could be adjusted later. I removed them entirely and permanently, not as an act of revenge, but as a declaration of independence, not the kind you post about online, but the kind that shows up in legal documents and bank instructions and beneficiary designations that cannot be rewritten without my signature. And for the final clause, the one that gave me the only sense of poetic justice I'd allow myself, I added a provision, a recurring donation in my grandfather's name, to a scholarship fund specifically reserved for first-generation college students who had been denied family support. It was not symbolic. It was precise. And it ensured that the money they thought they had diverted for a better investment would now serve people like me, people who had to earn everything from nothing and were never told they were worth less, only shown it in spreadsheets. And silence. Once the trust was filed, finalized, and funded, I sent my parents a 2-sentence message, not because I wanted to provoke them, but because I wanted to make my position as clear and documented as every step I'd taken until now. I am opting out of the family narrative. Any further contact will require written terms agreed upon in advance. I didn't explain what that meant, because they knew. And within a week, the certified envelope containing the formal settlement agreement arrived on my doorstep, signed, sealed, and accepted. They would repay a portion of the original amount from my custodial account over the next 3 years, through a third-party administrator I hired to handle all communication and disbursements. No calls. No emails. No casual check-ins. Just structure, boundaries, and distance, the 3 things they had always resented and now had no choice but to abide by. I didn't announce it. I didn't update anyone. I just lived in the aftermath of my own decision, not free from sadness, not untouched by grief, but entirely unburdened by the constant question of whether I was overreacting, whether I owed them something just because they shared my last name. And then, maybe a month later, the phone rang late one night, and I saw Evan's name on the screen. Not a text, not a voicemail, but a full call, and I let it ring, not because I wanted to hurt him, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I no longer owed him, or any of them, my availability. There was no speech, no final confrontation, no chance for them to rewrite the ending. I had taken every ounce of their betrayal and turned it into something they couldn't touch, not just legal protections, not just boundaries, but a life structured entirely outside of their reach. I still remember what Ben said when I told him everything was finalized. You didn't win with anger. You won with structure. That's the kind of victory that lasts. And maybe the most satisfying part is this. They will never know exactly how much I made, how much I protected, or how far I've gone. They won't be able to trace it, count it, or calculate what they lost, because what they really lost wasn't money or control or reputation, it was me. And now I am untouchable.